All right, the camera's rolling. Before we begin, I want to give a little public service announcement. Next week, there will not be class because next week I will be in San Diego to join my brother and his family in celebrating my nephew becoming a bar mitzvah, which is the first bar mitzvah in our family since mine. So we're beginning the next generation. So it's a very exciting time, but it does mean that we won't be in town. So you'll just have to go through the reruns on YouTube if you want to have your class next Wednesday. You're more than welcome to just gather around the computer and watch. But it also means that I wanted to take today to discuss not only the beginning of Parashat Devarim, the beginning of a whole new book of the Torah, but also to discuss a little bit about what's happening next week. Because next week there is a very special day in the Jewish calendar. Tisha B'Av, exactly, Tisha B'Av, the ninth day of the Hebrew month of Av. Rosh Chodesh Av, the beginning of the month of Av, happened Sunday night, Monday. And so we are now in the period known as the 9 days. I know, creative Jewish titles for things. Between the beginning of the month of Av and the Tisha B'Av itself. And so in addition to talking about Devarim, we're going to look through the lens of Tisha B'Av as well. And hopefully we'll also take some strength and solace and understanding of perspective on the current situation in Israel and that Jews are facing around the world that has come to light in the last few weeks. So that's our plan. Everyone's on the same page? Good. Let's get down to work. So we're going to begin with some Torah, obviously. And we're going to take a look at page 982. This is from the first chapter of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, and we're going to begin on verse 6, which is the in the Eitz Chaim. It's at the bottom of page 982. And I'm always open for volunteers to read on our behalf. Page 982, Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verse 6. Volunteer, Marion.
The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying...
By the way, what's Horeb? It's another name for something very famous. Mount Sinai, exactly. You cheated by looking at the commentary?
Yes.
That's not cheating, that's called learning. It's only cheating if you pass it off as your own work.
Okay. I like that, Rabbi.
Yeah. Exactly.
You will stay long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in Arabah, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, as far as the great river Euphrates. See, I place the land at your disposal. Go. Take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to them and to their heirs after them.
Okay, so this is picking up with Moses' recap of everything that's happened during the prior 40 years. This is at the end of Moses' life, the end of his service to the people and to God. And so he's doing a little recap, a little flashback. You can do the whole Scooby-Doo screen fade. And he's saying we were back at Horeb, and he's narrating, and we got the law, and then God said, everybody up, and time to go forth. And where are we headed? Well, the hill country, it's essentially Israel. We're headed to the land of Israel. And why are we going there rather than just staying at Mount Sinai forever? Because it was promised, exactly. We can come up with lots of other reasons, like Mount Sinai is not exactly a good neighborhood. It's the middle of nowhere, by definition. There's not much you can do there, not much of a livelihood, not much of a place to raise a family. But the most important reason why we're headed to Israel is because that was the original brit. That was the original covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, renewed with each of the successive generations until the 12 tribes, which was then given to all of them. The previous generations, the covenant was only with one of the children. That's what made the 12 tribe generation very different and why we're called the children of Israel, the other name for Jacob, rather than the children of Abraham or the children of Isaac. Make sense? So, it's easy, right? we get up, we've just got the Torah, it's just a few weeks march to the land of Israel, we're going to be there in no time. Yeah. What's that? It sounds like it at this point. It sounds like it at this point. We're going to take a little detour and skip this very important part. Remember, every part of the Torah is important, but for the narrative that we're focusing on today, we're going to continue on verse 19, where we actually start. The verse 9 to 18 is all about the organization of the community, and we'll talk about that another time. So pick up from verse 19.
We set out from Horeb and traveled the great and terrible wilderness that you saw, along the road to the hill country of the Amorites, as the Lord our God had commanded us. When we reached Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving to us. See, the Lord your God has placed the land at your disposal. Go up, take possession, as the Lord the God of your fathers promised you. Fear not and be not dismayed.
All right, so this is the moment of truth. We are at Kadesh Barnea. We are just south of the land of Israel, and it is ready to go up and take possession of the land. Sounds like it is imminent, yes?
Yes.
Of course, there's going to be just a small pause as the people have a request. Keep reading.
Then all of you came to me and said, let us send men ahead to
Reconnoiter, to spy out.
I know what it means, I just couldn't get it out.
Sometimes the Hebrew is easier than the English.
Reconnoiter the land for us and bring back word on the route we shall follow and the cities we shall come to. I approved of the plan, and so I selected 12 of your men, one from each tribe. They made for the hill country, came to the Wadi Eshkol, and spied it out. They took some of the fruit of the land with them and brought it down to us, and they gave us this report. It is a good land that the Lord our God is giving to us.
Woohoo! Okay, so everything's great, right? Notice a judicious retelling by Moses. So when he first describes this plan, he says the people instigated it. If you go back to Shlach Lecha, the parasha where this actually took place in the book of Numbers in Bamidbar, it seems more like it was a full leadership plan rather than a populist, grassroots-inspired plan. See, sometimes the words don't come out for me either. And Moses doesn't repeat the slanderous side of the report. He just repeats the positive, that it's a good land that God has given us. And yet, verse 26,
Yet you refused to go up and flouted the command of the Lord of your God, who sulked in your tents and said, it is because the Lord hates us that he brought us out of the land of Egypt, to hand us over to the Amorites to wipe us out. What kind of place are we going to? Our kinsmen have taken the heart out of us, saying, we saw there a people stronger and taller than we, large cities with walls sky high, and even Anakites.
Possibly a word for giants. Okay, so the people say no. We don't want to do it. Why not?
It's too hard.
It's too hard. It's not because the land isn't worth it. It's not because the land isn't nice. The land is indeed very, very nice. But that? We're going to go up against that? We can't. It's just too hard. And so that was the end of the story, right? No, not quite. So what happens at this point in history? You can read ahead if you like. It's not cheating. Or you can remember from the narrative that we've gone over every year for the last few thousand. What happens?
Why do we leave Egypt?
What's that?
Why do we leave Egypt?
Right. So what happens at this point now when the spies come back and the people are disheartened and we're
God turns them around and says, okay, go back to the way you came and wander for a while.
right. So
Wander for 40 years, and nobody who's an adult today is going to get to go into Israel.
no one over the age of 20, no one over the age of 20, except for two guys, is going to be allowed to go in, and that's Joshua and Caleb. because they were the two spies who came back and said, we can do it, and who had faith. Everyone else, you'll be buried here in the wilderness. And that includes Moses, Aaron, Miriam, and the great leaders of our people. That's why we're there for 40 years. It's not because we didn't know the way. It's not because it was too far a journey. It was because we weren't ready to follow at that moment. We weren't ready to go up. But it seemed so simple, right? It seemed like if we had the strength, we would have made it. Yes, it seems like if we had the faith, that we could have done it at that point. And one of the interesting things about Jewish history is that we often have these flashpoints in our past where it seems like things could have gone differently. Seems like things could have gone better. And it's often, when we reflect on them, heartbreaking when we try to contain the enormity of the events of our history. And the day that we contain most of the worst of our history that has had to offer is Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av. So I want to make sure that we fully understand what that day commemorates. So handout is coming around. Oh, not too bad. So depending upon how you, where you peg your start of the calendar, Tisha B'Av is part of a series of events that commemorate the catastrophe that led up to the destruction of the temple by Babylon, the first temple, which wasn't just about the destruction of the temple, of course. It was about a loss of Jewish sovereignty and independence. But each of the days that leads up also has something else within it to teach us. So the 10th of Tevet is when the siege of Jerusalem began. The 17th of Tammuz, which was just a few weeks ago, was when the walls of Jerusalem were breached, when the Babylonians were able to smash through in order to attack and destroy the city. But according to our Midrashim, according to the teachings of our sages, the 17th of Tammuz was also the same day that the first tablets of Mount Sinai were broken, the golden calf incident. The day that the Seleucids burnt the first Torah scroll. Who were the Seleucids again? See if we've been paying attention.
One of the Greek dynasties.
One of the Greek dynasties, and what's their connection to Judaism? Why do we especially dislike the Seleucids more than, say, the Ptolemies?
Our adversaries in the Hanukkah.
They are the adversaries in the Hanukkah story, right? When you want to talk about Antiochus and all of those fun folk, that was the Seleucid Empire. I know we talk about them as being Greeks or Hellenized Assyrians and all these other terms that we try to use to cover over the fact that it's hard to say Seleucid and hard to remember the word, but that's who they were. So the idea was that on the 17th of Tammuz, their oppression of Judaism began with the destruction, the burning of the Sefer Torah deliberately to suppress Judaism, and that, of course, then triggered the events that led to the rebellion of the Maccabees and the second Jewish independence. And also an idol under their rule was erected in the temple. And then Tisha B'Av, well, we got a long list here. Right? So, of course, most famously, Tisha B'Av commemorates the destruction of the first and the second temples. That is to say, the destruction by the Babylonians in 586 and the destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. But Tisha B'Av does not only, according to our tradition, commemorate that, it also is the same day that God commanded that we would not get into Egypt with that first generation. That the day of God's commandment against the spies, the incident that we're talking about right here in this part of Devarim, is the same day that God said, okay, you're not going up. You're not going to get to the land of Israel. You'll stay out here in the Sinai wilderness for a while in Bamidbar. And if you're over 20, look around. This is going to be your graveyard. If you're under 20, don't worry, you can get in. But not just that. It was also the fall and the massacre of Beitar, which was the revolt against Rome that came around the year 134, 135, 136. And the fall of Beitar led to the actual worst repercussions for the Jewish communities of the land of Israel at the time. Prior to that, life was no picnic, but the Romans tolerated Jews and Judaism within the land of Israel, even after the revolt that led in 70 to the destruction of the Second Temple. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, Romans weren't having any of it. And the saying goes that the price of a Jewish slave on the Roman markets became almost worthless. That is to say that so many Jews were carried off in captivity, in addition to all of those who had been murdered and massacred, that we caused a glut on the slave market. And it destroyed almost entirely the stability of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, which is ultimately what led to the diaspora and Jews finding their stability outside the land of Israel for most of the last 2,000 years. Which is, in case you were ever wondering, why has it been that so few Jews have maintained a continuous presence in the land of Israel? There have been some, but not a lot. Thank the Roman persecutions after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was finished with the fall of Beitar. That was the last stronghold. It's always been a bit painful to me that everybody knows the name of Masada, but nobody seems to remember Beitar. And Beitar was the much greater catastrophe than Masada. But then no one made a movie about Beitar, so what are you going to do? It's also the day the Romans plowed the Temple Mount into desolation, that they didn't just destroy the temple, they leveled the ground, making it as though nothing had been there. It's the day that the First Crusade was declared by the Pope in 1095, which was not just a problem for the Jews who lived in the land of Israel when the Crusaders showed up, but was also a huge problem for Jews who lived in Europe, where many Crusaders decided to have target practice on the Jewish communities there. So, why go all the way to the Holy Land when you can kill infidels and heretics right here in your backyard? And many Jewish communities were persecuted. Many of them were wiped off the face of the map in Europe during this time period. And it really became a tipping point for Jewish life in medieval Europe. Again, life was no picnic before the First Crusades, but after the Crusade period began, the fortunes of Jews within the European world began a decline that would speed up at different times, but it pretty much maintained a decline all the way until the Enlightenment began. Jews were expelled from England in 1290 on Tisha B'Av. Anyone know, for extra credit trivia points, when the Jews came back to England? Oliver Cromwell invited the Jews back to England during the revolution that changed England and deposed the king and all of that. Oliver Cromwell invited Jews back into England in the 1600s to reestablish a presence there. And even though he lost eventually too, Jews were allowed to remain and continued. So that was actually a very important part for Jewish stability, because much of what happened to Jews in England was the Jews of England were spared many of the turmoils that happened on the continent. The Spanish expulsion of 1492 was requested to be done on Tisha B'Av. That is to say, the community of Jews in Spain said, we know you're going to kick us out in the next short period of time. If you could you make the edict effective on this day? Why would they ask for the edict to go into effect on Tisha B'Av?
They didn't want another fast day?
Exactly. They didn't want another fast day. There's a statement within rabbinic literature which says that God has kindly bundled our miseries, bundled them together, so that we should not have a calendar that is littered with a fast day for each and every one of these catastrophes. Because you can imagine, we would have a lot more fast days if each one of these events had happened on a different day and we were commemorating them all. Very important for current time, since we are at the 100-year anniversary. World War I began on Tisha B'Av. And in addition to World War I being a human tragedy of massive proportions, in which many, many Jews died fighting on both sides of the war, World War I also set into motion the events that would lead to the Holocaust, as Germany tried to restructure itself after the war. and used the Jews as scapegoats for many of the feelings of anger and frustration that they had. And it also set into motion the rise of the Soviet Union, which would crush the Jews who still lived in the Russian areas after the war, under the boot of communism and repression of our faith there. So World War I, 100 years ago on Tisha B'Av, was the beginning of the end of a stable European Jewish population. We didn't entirely know it then, but it set into motion, and had World War I not begun, we would have had a very different life in the 20th century, especially in Europe. How are we doing so far? So it's a depressing list, isn't it? The removal of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the death camps began also on Tisha B'Av, and in 1994, the JCC in Buenos Aires was bombed by Iranian agents, killing 100 people and injuring many more. Okay, so we're all feeling miserable? Good. You're supposed to. You're supposed to. So, but how do we reconcile? How do we understand this? If we read through the Devarim, what we just saw, it all looks so easy. Right? We're going to go up to the land of Israel, we'll take possession of it, and everything will be fine. And yet, we have a history that even once we finally did get to the land of Israel, things weren't so fine. How do we reconcile? How do we look back on this history as something other than just an unmitigated list of disasters and misery? Or is that how we all look at it, and we just, fast for a day and move on? Don't think about Tisha B'Av much? I know it's one of those summer events, which means it doesn't get a lot of attendance, not widely attended. A reminder that we do have a community-wide Tisha B'Av commemoration coming up on Monday night and Tuesday morning of next week. The Monday night will be at Ohev Shalom, and the Tuesday morning will be at the JCC Community Minyan. Had to get the commercial in. It also gave you a little bit more time to think.
It's too depressing.
It's still depressing.
It's too depressing.
What's that?
It's too depressing.
It's too depressing. So if something's too depressing, we
We block it out.
block it out. We don't want to talk about it, don't want to think about it, just block it out. Well, we do limit much of what we do. As you can see from the 17th of Tammuz, from the fast of Tammuz going on, is the 3 weeks, and we do have a more subdued atmosphere. We don't do voluntary celebrations like weddings and whatnot. We don't get haircuts. We don't go through opportunities to say the Shechianu. Meaning we wouldn't go out of our way to buy new clothes that we didn't get to say the Shechianu, or we wouldn't go out of our way to get a new species of fruit that we would say Shechianu when eating, and that sort of thing. And then from Rosh Chodesh Av, like I said, from Sunday night, Monday, through Tisha B'Av next week, those prohibitions continue, but we also don't have freshly pressed clothes and shiny clean laundry, and we don't go around splashing for fun in the water, and there's a common custom as well to not eat meat during this period.
Are you asking what's the point?
I'm asking, how do we personally hold on to this? What do we do? Do we do?
I think it's a time for introspection. I mean, it forces you to say, well, what's wrong with us? Why does everybody hate us? Why do they want to do these things to us? And how can we make ourselves better and stronger so we don't have to be?
All through history, it's been like this for the Jews.
Yeah.
So all through history, it's been like this for the Jews. But to paraphrase a wonderful demotivational poster I once saw, yes, they do make demotivational posters. It says, the common element in all your failed relationships is you. And as Michael says, perhaps, does this make us think that if all of these things have happened to us, maybe it's us? Maybe we did it? Certainly, the incident with the Meraglim, with the spies, that we just read about in Devarim, and that we commemorate on Tisha B'Av, certainly that incident, the Torah wants us to think, was our fault. Right? We did not have to spend 40 years in the wilderness. We did not have to go through the trials and tribulations of the wilderness. And Moses says very poignantly later on within the same section that he could have made it to Israel if we hadn't messed up And therefore our lack of faith caused massive repercussions, not just for each individual, but for the whole community. So are we supposed to then view all the other incidents as being our fault? Is that why we fast? Is that why we reduce our pleasure? Is that why we afflict ourselves? Because we are somehow trying to do penance for having caused these catastrophes to ourselves? Is that the lesson that's here?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Uncomfortable with the idea that we would blame ourselves for all of this? Or
I think collectively, as the Jewish people, we think of ourselves as pretty decent human beings.
Mhm.
We've been at the forefront in years past of social actions to help other people who are less, who have less going for them than we do. We've tried, you know, the people who are being put upon by others. We've always worked, going way back. We've always worked to
right,
make life better for
historically, the Jewish communities have always been as compassionate, if not more compassionate, than any of the surrounding societies that we lived amongst. That when other people permitted the acts of spousal abuse, we said no. When other people permitted murder and theft and pillaging, we said no. That when other people said, well, you know, the poor were just going to die in the gutters, we said no, that we were going to take care of them. That yes, Judaism has had, since its inception and throughout history, a very strong tendency to be more just than most of the societies that surrounded it.
And I don't think we stop to think, well, it's because we're making up for what we did or didn't do when we were in the Mount Sinai area. I don't know why we are that way, but we seem to be, and you may have an explanation.
Nope, that's we're working through it itself. This is group therapy.
Well, those kinds of behaviors, the behavior you're describing, could be a result of the introspection caused by the misfortunes that developed over the centuries.
So, because we reread the story of the spies, for example, we learned from their mistake about failing to have faith in God's ability or willingness to fulfill the covenant with us, and therefore we had greater faith in the future because of that introspection. Is that an adequate example of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, we learned something from every one of these events and put it to good use.
Right, and indeed, there is a tension within Jewish thinking, within Jewish law, that when a disaster befalls us, or as individuals or collectively, that we should have introspection, we should have self-reflection, we should examine our deeds. But we also know that many of the catastrophes that befall individuals and our community were not our fault. And there is this tension behind becoming complacent and always feeling that we are just victimized, and overly blaming ourselves for what's happening. And finding a balance between that, of growing from the experiences, but doing so in a way that doesn't either diminish the experience or diminish us, is a unique chemistry within our faith. So if you turn the page, we're going to talk about one of the earliest examples of trying to find that balance. So this is from Baba Batra from the Talmud. Mary, do you want to keep reading for me?
The rabbis taught when the second temple was destroyed, many of Israel separated themselves from eating meat and drinking wine.
Right, all right, the temple's been destroyed. And so you know what? All joy is gone from the world. Therefore, meat and wine, which is the symbol of joy and celebration, never again. Becoming a vegetarian out of grief. Becoming a teetotaler in mourning.
And Rabbi Joshua approached them, saying, "My children, why do you not eat meat and drink wine?" They replied, should we eat meat of which sacrifices were brought, or drink wine which was offered at the altar?
Right? So they're saying, look, the meat and the wine remind us of what we have lost. They remind us of our connection through the Beit HaMikdash, through the temple to God. How can we still enjoy these things when their greatest fulfillment, their greatest use, has been destroyed, has been ruined, has been turned to ash? They reminds us too much of our pain.
Said Rabbi Joshua to them, if so, let us not eat bread, as the meal offering is also abolished.
Right? We're not doing the meal offering, so what do you do in eating bread?
Then we can live on fruit.
And they said, you're right. You're right. No meat, no wine, no bread. We'll just eat fruit, and we'll be fine. So they're a fruitarian now.
But was there not also the first fruit offering? And was it not also the custom to put water on the altar, which no longer exists? Let us then cease the use of fruit and of water also. And they were silent.
Meaning they shut up.
Yes.
Right, so what is Rabbi Joshua trying to help them realize?
Goes on.
Life goes on. It's the simplest way to put it. Life goes on. Yes, there is cause for grief. And yes, there is pain. But life does go on. And if you try to remove everything about the disaster, everything that might remind you about the disaster or might bring you to grief in its memory, you will starve yourself to death. You wouldn't be able to live. And instead, he tries to sum it up very compassionately to the community.
Then said Rabbi Joshua to them, my children, come and listen to me. It would be wrong not to mourn at all, because the evil decree is executed. But to mourn too much is also impossible, as there must not be decreed a prohibition for the congregation, which they could not stand.
Okay, so we're going to pause there. We'll talk about his solution in a second of how to balance this mourning. But see what he's saying here. We can't ignore the grief, the pain, the heart-wrenching horrors that have happened throughout our history. And remember, this was only at the destruction of the Second Temple, and there was a lot more left to come, but the message remains the same. But on the other hand, we can't only mourn. We can't make that our standard of life, and we can't institute practices of commemoration and grief that the congregation cannot stand, cannot fulfill. That's a very interesting rabbinic principle, that although there are times when events happen when the sages must institute new enactments, there's a limit to what can be enacted, and that limit is what can be fulfilled. That the rabbis are not empowered to just create any old law they might like. If they create a law that no one can fulfill, then the law is no longer a law. Right? If compliance is impossible by the majority of the community, then the law is not the law of that community, no matter how many times the rabbi says it. That doesn't go for Torah, by the way. We're talking about rabbinic enactments. Torah, just because you don't think you can live it, doesn't mean the Torah gets abrogated. But there's a notion here that if you try to create a system of mourning that is overly strong, it's not just that people will be unable to do it, it's the community itself will no longer stand. The community would collapse from that type of creation. If what these people were doing, of having no meat and no wine forever, had become the norm, if Rabbi Joshua had not dissuaded them from taking this on as a permanent institution, do we really think people would have been able to sustain Judaism for 2,000 years if they had lived a joyless life because of that catastrophe? If they were never able to get together and have a festive and meaty meal for Rosh Hashanah and for the new year, to have a Seder that had a beautiful meat as part of that sustenance and joy, if everything was just bare lentils and water, how long would we have lasted? If we never replenished our sense of joy, despite the catastrophes, we would not have lasted long. And so Rabbi Joshua provides some guidance.
It isn't literally the meat and wine, it's the sense of joy.
Correct. Correct. And yes, I should point out, I'm not trying to say that vegetarians today or people who don't drink can't have joy. but it would be the idea that they were refraining from what was considered essential ingredients to joy in the ancient world. And certainly the people in the ancient world didn't have meat and wine as often as we did, or at least not in the same quantities and strength. So that, you're right, it's a symbol of being able to celebrate that they're pointing out most powerfully. All right, so what's his solution?
Therefore the sages said, when one paints his house, he shall leave part unpainted as a sign of mourning. One may prepare all that he needs for his meal, leaving out some little things as a sign of mourning. And the same is the case with a woman. She may dress with all her
I'm not sure where the handouts are.
leaving
They're
out
over there.
some of the unimportant for that purpose. As it is written, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget. May my tongue cleave to my palate if I do not remember you. If I recall not Jerusalem at the head of my joy, what is meant by at the head of my joy? Said Rob Isaac, it is the custom to put some ashes on the head of the groom on the day of marriage.
All right. So it's still a
custom.
custom in some communities, but the custom that you're probably all much more familiar with is the breaking of a glass,
Yeah.
which is also related to this, to a notion that even at the peak of our celebration, at a peak of our joy, we are going to remind ourselves of the catastrophe and destruction and the continued unbrokenness, continued brokenness of the world. But we're also still going to get married, and we're still going to have a party, and we're still going to celebrate. And that balance is how Judaism has brought this together for the last 2,000 plus years.
Now, when somebody is in mourning
Mm-hmm.
because of a recent death, the wedding ceremony goes on, but the celebration does not.
Depending upon the person, the time, etc. So yes, if you have a bride and a groom, and the best man's father dies, the week before the wedding, then the best man would still be allowed to attend the ceremony, but he would not be going to the party,
Yeah.
to the festivities. Exactly. So there is a balance for personal mourning as well, not just for the case of national mourning that's being discussed here. So there are little reminders that Rabbi Joshua was saying that we would build in to our community, to our society, to our lives, that remind us that not everything is peachy keen in the world, that not everything is happy and perfect. The small unpainted section in the opposite your door in your house reminds you that it's not 100% perfect. But it also is not sitting on the floor in ash and sackcloth and just eating lentils and drinking water for 2,000 years. There's enough of a reminder, but it is not we're not submerging ourselves in constant grief.
Rav Ishmael Bar Elisha said, from that day when the temple was destroyed, it would be only right we should take upon ourselves not to eat meat and not to drink wine. But such a thing, which the majority of the congregation could not endure, must not be decreed.
And I think we feel this even to I hope to a certain extent in the current situation in Israel. How can we, before the 9 days began, but when the situation last week and the weeks before, how could we have a party, knowing that our brothers and sisters are under attack and that soldiers are dying defending Eretz Israel? How could I, watch something frivolous on TV, knowing that the threat of these terrorist attacks is only increasing in the current situation in Israel? It's very natural to feel that way, to say I don't have any right to be at peace in my home when my brothers and sisters are running for shelters. But
But life goes on.
but life goes on. It doesn't mean that we ignore.
No, but aside from life going on, in this case, with what's going on in Israel, if we succumb to our grief, then the enemy has won. We have to keep on going as normally as possible because we're strong people.
Exactly right. The weapon of terrorism is to suck the will to live and survive from its victims, to then allow an inferior military force to overcome a superior one. And Israel, as you say, can't give in to that, nor can we. It doesn't mean that we ignore the situation in Israel. It doesn't mean like we pretend that it's not happening. You know, if someone was to have had a bar mitzvah or a wedding, I would expect them to be able to mention during the ceremony, during the celebration, you know, that we celebrate here in freedom and joy, but our hearts are still with our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. Some way to mention that connection, even as we continue to do things that for some of our Israeli siblings can't because of the circumstances. But even in Israel, you'll find people are still having marriages, they're still having bar mitzvahs, they're still having celebrations, they're still going to the cafe. They are still trying to enjoy life as well as defend and support those that are on the front line.
Neil Wedman spoke with his cousins who live near Ramallah,
Mm-hmm.
and what she said is people are sometimes clogging roads, bringing and giving hot food to the troops.
Mm.
Jewish mothers and fathers still worry about the children's stomachs as part of the welfare.
Absolutely, absolutely. We don't stop that, and we don't stop the hope and the celebration. Marion, if you can just read the last
Yes.
paragraph here.
And the word of the Lord of hosts came
Bless
to
you.
me, saying, Thus said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, and the fast of the 5th, and the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness and cheerful feasts. Therefore love the truth and peace.
So the prophet Zechariah prophesied that these days of fast that we discussed on the front side of the handout will one day, in the days of redemption, be turned into days of celebration and of joy. And that promise has been part of what sustains us through the grief that we feel every Tisha B'Av and on these other days of commemoration. That we know that ultimately, just like our ancestors who were unable to get into Israel when they should have, ultimately they did, so too we may not be living in a world at peace and in security the way we wish, but ultimately the world will be redeemed. And ultimately all of these commemorations will be not forgotten, but will be turned into steps that were taken through history to reach that ultimate point of redemption. And that hope has to stay with us continually as a source of strength and nourishment.
When we go to synagogue to commemorate the destruction of the first and second temples, that's the primary emphasis, isn't it? We're not made, I don't recall being made aware that dramatically of all these other incidents that occurred.
Depends on the synagogue. So certainly, you know, the communities that survived the expulsion from Spain felt and commemorated it very keenly on Tisha B'Av. The communities that went through the horrors of the Crusades continued to feel and commemorate those destructions on Tisha B'Av. So it is true that we don't necessarily bring to the surface all of these events with equal weight, because some of them are more universal than others. But it is common to mention and to recall the additional catastrophes that have befallen on this day.
I just think it's extraordinary that some of these events actually occurred or started on that specific time.
On that same day. Well, like I said, the sages were very clear that that was a sign of God's goodness. Like I said near the beginning, it's very easy to look at this and to think that the main problem with all of this is us. But the very fact that it happened on the same day, ironic as it may seem, is a sign that it's not just us, that God loves us. If God didn't love us, he would have made these all be different days so we could be miserable the entire year.
It's one way to look at it.
It's one way to look at it, and it's a way that our sages have looked at it for thousands of years. That we are not always able to control or prevent the evil that others will choose to do. We are asked to control and prevent the evil that's within our hands, of course. But the evil of others, the Crusades, the expulsion from Spain, the expulsion from England, etc., the Roman destruction of Beitar, we blame the others for doing that, for having evil intentions and designs upon our people and to carry out these plans of evil. And we are thankful that although we were caught up in that storm, that we are able to contain our grief to this day, rather than have been either swept away by the destruction or to grieve in perpetuity for the destruction. And that's considered a sign of God's kindness, of God's goodness to us. That he had to, unfortunately, allow freedom of free will for those that would choose to do evil, but he could at least shelter us from our future grief by having it occur within the confines of Tisha B'Av. I know it may not seem like much comfort, but when trying to look forward in hope and peace, when we see anti-Semitic riots across Europe and problems even within this country, it's important to remember that it's not just us. It's not that we are causing others to hate us. Others will hate us for a whole variety of reasons, and anti-Semitism is a very complicated network of different phenomena. It's not just one thing. But we should have hope that one day the rest of the world, and we for our part, will get it. And it will be a thing of the past. It will be swept away into history, and we will look upon these days as days to celebrate. That no longer do we have to grieve for the continuing pattern of suffering and destruction, but can see it now as having been something that happened but is gone. And we hope that happens speedily and in our own day. Any other questions? Yes.
These restrictions.
Oh, yes.
on campuses and stuff, is this typical of, does conservative Judaism do a lot of these, or is it just Ashkenazi tradition?
These are common traditions. The conservative movement does consider many of them to be advisable. Some of them are a little bit more open to interpretation. So, for example, most conservative rabbis, myself included, would feel that seeing Jerusalem in its current state, it would be wrong to tear our clothes. It's under Jewish control. It is a free city, and to tear our clothes would almost be a denial of the sacrifice that our people have made to have Jerusalem as the capital of our homeland in the modern times. So most conservative rabbis would not recommend tearing our clothes at seeing Jerusalem in its current state. Even though it's not perfect, even though it's not in peace, it still would seem counter to show complete mourning with the partial redemption that we seem to be experiencing. Keeping one cubit unpainted is still highly recommended. I wouldn't walk out of a house if it weren't. And houses, the architecture might be a little different, doesn't always allow that, but doing something to that effect is still a very good way of keeping this in mind. The ornate wall decorations, no, most people do not follow that. The place empty at the table, if you're having guests, not uncommon, just to put put an extra fork out, an extra thing, just something that sits, you don't even have to talk about it, just to be there. Leaving jewelry sets incomplete, that is somewhat commonly, depends on how complicated your jewelry is. I don't really have complicated jewelry personally, and nor does my wife, so it's not really something that happens much within my family. Ashes on the forehead of the groom, most don't continue to practice that. And there are very few, even outside of our movement, even within the Orthodox, who prohibit music altogether. But there are a few groups that do. That's the quick rundown. Yes?
Well, I can't help but notice that all these tragedies happening on this day, not all of them directly targeted Israel. It is also an ancient pagan holiday called Lugnasad, which is, they have some very troublesome beliefs. And a lot of things are making sense now because of this. But my question is, there are no particular, marriages still go on, births of course
Mhm.
still go on. So no restrictions about circumcision.
No, well, circumcisions,
surrounding birth.
right, circumcisions happen 8 days after the birth.
Regardless.
Regardless, absolutely, exactly. If a baby was born 8 days before Tisha B'Av, he would be circumcised on Tisha B'Av. It's not something. And in fact, there is a midrash that the Mashiach will be born on Tisha B'Av.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that's correct?
No, I think it's meant to be symbolic, which means that if someone claimed to be the Mashiach because Tisha B'Av was their birthday, I would want more. I want more credentials than that, a little more proof than that. But I think what the rabbis were saying by that was that we will the seeds of our redemption were planted even with the destruction.
I know a lot of people who have birthdays around then and closer than, and I don't think any of them anywhere near.
Well, if they were near, it'd be nice. But unfortunately, I think we still have a little bit longer to wait. All right, take care, everyone.